with a new film version of the classic All Quiet on the Western Front. In this episode, we look at a preview of the film. Is it different to the original version? And what understandings might it bring to a new generation unconnected to the Great War? This week on the Old Frontline podcast, we're doing something different. We're not reviewing a film that we've all been out to see. We're actually previewing a film that is yet to be released, and that is the new version of All Quiet on the Western Front. And in that, I'm very grateful to podcast listener Phil de Semlin from Time Out and the team at Netflix UK for having the chance to watch the film before it's on general release via a limited cinema release in mid-October and then release on Netflix itself about 10 days later. Now, this is a film that I've been excited about for quite some time, since I saw some of the first black and white stills from the production of it a few years ago. The trench scenes depicted in those stills looked incredible, very realistic, very well done. It was clear just from those that this was a serious film about the First World War, and now, having had a chance to watch it, I'm even more convinced with that. I think it's one of the most important Great War films that we've seen for some time, and it ranks up there with recent productions like Journey's End and 1917. One of the problems that I always find with many First World War films is not what the buttons are, not whether they're wearing something in the right way, but often films and television productions connected to the Great War don't feel convincing. They don't look as if it's set in that period. The men don't look like soldiers. It doesn't feel like this is a bird's eye view, an insight into conflict, what conflict is really like. Often they're too stereotyped. This film is not like that at all. It is very convincing, very brutal. Brutal is a word that I'll probably use a few times in this preview. But first of all, before we get to the film itself, let's look at All Quiet on the Western Front. Where did that come from and who wrote it? Published originally in German as Im Westen nicht Neues by the author Erich Maria Remarque, it first appeared in a German newspaper when it was serialized in 1928, and then the first book edition came out the following year. It became a worldwide bestseller. Something like 2.5 million copies were sold in 22 different languages in the first 18 months after publication. And it came out in that period just after a decade after the Great War, when a lot of memoirs, often many of them fictionalized memoirs, were being published. Books by Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves, Frank Richards, which we've often discussed in this podcast, all come from that period. And this book was Remarque's own attempt from a German viewpoint, unusually from a German viewpoint, because so little had really been published that got beyond Germany itself, that was translated into English and got a wider audience. But this was Remarque's attempt to look at his war again from the perspective of fiction. And this is possibly a podcast in its own right, but the way that many soldier authors fictionalize their wars or turn their war into fiction is an interesting phenomena, both of the First and the Second World War. Perhaps many men who'd been through that conflict, experienced that conflict, could look at it properly from a distance of time, as this book was published a decade after the war, but also from the perspective of it being fiction. Maybe it was easier to discuss the horrors, the experience, the comrades, and everything else that mixes in with that experience of war in the trenches of the Western Front. Maybe it was easier to do that in a fictionalized account. But who was Remarque himself? He was born as Eric Paul Remarque, spelt differently to the way his surname is spelt on the copies of the book. That's Remarque, and he was born as Remark. He was born into a German Roman Catholic family in Osnabrück in June 1898, not into a Jewish family as later Nazi propaganda claimed. I mentioned the spelling of his surname. The Nazis claimed that this in itself was a falsehood, that his real name was Kramer, and Remarque was just simply Kramer, spelt backward, that he was a Jew, and his work was declared degenerate. by the National Socialists, and his books were banned and were amongst those that were burnt during that period. Remarque was conscripted in June 1917, and he was posted to the 15th Reserve Infantry Regiment. His frontline service was relatively short. He served in northern France and then during the Third Battle of Ypres, opposite not the British and Commonwealth forces, but opposite the French in the Houthulst sector to the north of the Ypres salient battlefield. He was wounded there on the 31st of July 1917, the opening day of the Third Battle of Ypres, by shrapnel, and spent most of the rest of the war in hospital until his demobilisation in 1919, when he went home and trained as a teacher. But what he really wanted to do was write, and that led him down many career paths until he was able to produce his first book and pen his experiences in the Great War into that fictionalised account that became All Quiet on the Western Front. Im Westen nicht Neues, All Quiet on the Western Front, is an anti-war book. It was different to books like Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel, for example, which really portrayed the German soldier, rightly I'm sure in many cases, as a heroic warrior fighting on the battlefields. For Remarque, his view of the war was very different. He portrays the heroism of the soldiers, but is not slow to criticise those in charge and criticise the direction of the war and the way the war was fought and men were caught up in it and their lives destroyed. Because of this, because it didn't fall into that traditional view of how soldiers, German soldiers, should be depicted, this is what led to the Nazis declaring that his work was degenerate. But by then he'd left for America. His family remained behind. His sister was arrested and subsequently murdered by the Nazis, and Remarque was sent a bill for her subsequent execution. So once again, this episode of the Great War interweaves with later periods and the next war, like so much of what we talk about when we talk about the history of the First World War. With this new production, there have now been 3 versions, film versions, of All Quiet on the Western Front. The first of those was made in 1930. With the publication of the book in English, it became a bestseller. I remember my own grandfather's copy of this. He'd served as a soldier at the end of the Great War in 1918, was a very similar age to Remarque, and that much-thumbed copy of his, which was read by him and by my mother and my grandmother many times, obviously struck a resonance with him and those around him, as it did with many people. And that first English version led to the Hollywood's 1930 production of All Quiet on the Western Front, starring Lou Ayres, that classic black and white version of it, which many of us have seen. I can remember sitting there with my grandmother and watching this film, and it enabling her in many respects to talk about her lost cousins who'd been killed in the Great War. Although it depicted German soldiers, many, I think, see it as a kind of universal image of the Great War, that these men are no different than any other nation, and the way that the story of French soldiers in the book and in the films weaves into it is all part of that, I think. And with remakes and the fact that there is a classic black and white version, very often people see that as the sacrosanct, untouchable, original version that can never be bettered. And of course, it is a very powerful film. The fact that it's in black and white is powerful in its own right, I think, really. And I'm sure, like many listeners to this podcast, it will have helped shape our view of what the Great War was all about. But a second version of the film was made by CBS TV in 1979. It was a television adaptation of the film in colour. And this one starred Richard Thomas, who was then famous as John Boy in The Waltons, and the even more famous Ernest Borgnine. And there were also appearances in it from Ian Holm and Donald Pleasant, so it was quite a well-known cast. Whereas the first version had almost created a star out of Lou Ayres, this version had a lot of well-known actors in it for the time. I like this second version, the 1979 version. It's a good adaptation. Bits of it are a little bit cheesy. Some of the trench scenes are excellent. The depiction of the battlefield is excellent. And again, it's a film that I've watched countless times over the years, and once more has helped add to the way I view and see the First World War. There's no doubt about that. So with 2 previous versions, was there room for another one? This new one is a modern film made in modern times, and filmed while war was raging once more on European soil, probably only hundreds of miles from where the filming took place. So what of this new version? What can it tell us? What can we expect from it? What insights can we get into the Great War from a new version of an old book and an old film? What do we think of this new version of All Quiet on the Western Front? The first question to ask with this new version of All Quiet on the Western Front, what exactly is it? Is it a remake of the original film, word for word, story plot to story plot, or is it a reimagination of that original story? And that is definitely what this is. It takes the book by Remarque as its starting point, and the characters are used throughout, but the storyline is different. It's a new version, a modern version of the story. And for some people, that will no doubt signal alarm bells, but believe me, this is a good and credible reimagination of Remarque's excellent book. It takes a different story path compared to the original book, where Paul Baumer and his friends at school at the beginning of the Great War are inspired to enlist by their teacher and all march off as volunteers, as Kriegsfreiwillige. And then heading to the fronts, Paul and his comrades go through battle after battle. They meet old soldier Stanislaus Kaczynski, Kat, who becomes a central figure, like a father figure in many respects to the men, and he helps them try and get through their experiences and becomes Paul Baumer's best friend. The war slogs on. The Germans fight the French again and again, and gradually that list of friends that surrounds Paul diminishes until only he is left, and he's killed on a quiet day in October 1918, leading to that phrase, Im Westen nicht Neues, published in the German army communique, signalling that it was all quiet on the Western Front, to use a British phrase that nothing of importance was going on. And that was the power of it. A soldier like Paul, having gone through all of that, experienced so many battles, gets killed in a quiet sector so close to the end of the war. This new version is different. It starts on the German landscape at dawn. Here is the homeland, the Heimat that they're all fighting for, and it follows a period not from the very beginning of the war, but begins in the spring of 1917 in northern Germany. We see a typical northern German town, and within it a school, a college, and there's Paul Baumer and all of his familiar classmates awaiting their turn to graduate and to go into the army, not as volunteers this time, but as conscripts. There's a story arc at the very beginning that ties into when Paul enlists. And because this is a preview before the film is released, I'm not going to fill this full of spoilers, but it's an interesting little story arc that I think from the very beginning demonstrates what an anti-war film this is. And in that, following the genesis of Remarque's book in 1929. We see from this early phase of the film that these are all young men born in 1899, and they're being conscripted at age 18 in 1917. The headmaster of the school or the college stands there and tells them that they are the iron youth of Germany, the future of Germany, that the future of Germany is in their hands. But already you get this sense that what we're seeing here is a doomed generation, that there is no future for this iron youth. And then we see boys transformed into men in uniform, marching to the front. There's very little about the training that they get. It goes straight into them approaching the front line. The training and background and connection to the home front isn't really part of this story. I think from the very beginning, the director, Edward Berger, a German director, probably not that familiar to an English-speaking audience unless you've watched Deutschland 83, which is probably one of his best-known works in the West. I think what he's trying to demonstrate with the story of Paul and his comrades is how they are one of these cogs, the cogs of this vast war machine, and that's a theme that runs right through the movie. From marching to transport in a series of trucks, we discover that Paul and his comrades are heading to the Malmaison sector, an actual part of the Western Front on the Chemin des Dames. between La Faux and the central part of the Chemin des Dames, that high ground west of Reims. And here we discover that they've been posted to an actual unit, the 78th Reserve Infantry Regiment, which is a Prussian regiment, which in the time span of this film served on the Aisne, Ypres, Verdun in 1917, and then in the battles of 1918, including the fighting in the Oise sector in the final weeks of the war. But this is not trying to depict an actual regiment in its actual battles, it's trying to tell a story. And the most interesting aspect of this is they're not coming to fight the British or Empire units or Americans, they're coming to fight the French. And that's very much part of what the original All Quiet book demonstrated, as this was a war against a big enemy that for Germany, for most of the war, was France. Because when we look at 450 miles of the Western Front, most of it is held by the French army. So for most of the war, the Germans were fighting French soldiers. And I think that's an interesting insight that we take away from all of the different versions of All Quiet on the Western Front. And rather than go through battle after battle, what the film shows in the early stages, the attrition rates of young soldiers arriving on the battlefield at this period of the war. And we discover very, very quickly, and I've used this phrase before and will no doubt use it again, we discover what a brutal film this is and the brutal way it portrays the reality of life and death on the Western Front in the Great War. The film then takes a big period leap. It jumps on 18 months to the autumn of 1918, and this is where the new film version differs from the original book and the previous two film adaptations of it, in that they're moving on to the final phase of the war. Rather than Paul serve in battle after battle and gets killed in a quiet sector, the film moves to the final days of the First World War, with the last hour or so of this nearly 2.5 hour film taking place in November of 1918. And watching it, I was struck that perhaps the producers and the directors might well have seen our Last Day of World War I documentary that we did more than a dozen years ago with Michael Palin fronting it, because it follows some of the storylines that we used in that. In particular, what we see is the bringing in of a new level of story to this, really, by introducing Matthias Erzberger. He was a German Centre Party politician from the period, who was the one that took the German delegation across the French lines to eventually sign the armistice in the Compiègne forest on the 11th of November 1918, connecting the story of Paul and the men in the trenches with what was happening on the wider political scale and the war coming to an end, enables those behind the film to bring in the dramatic conclusion of the film with a fictitious German attack in the last moments of the war. So all of this very different to Remarque's own story. Why have they done this? Well, I think this is a new version. It's a modern version. It's a modern German take on the First World War. And I think we've got to consider that. This is not a British view of the war or even a French view of the war. This is a German, largely German production team and German writers and German actors. So we see it from that perspective, something that we don't normally see in connection with the Great War. And I think to bring the story to its conclusion with the end of the war, in a story that is about futility of conflict and the tragedy of conflict and the tragedy of the loss within that conflict and the way that resonates with current modern events in the Ukraine. And I think Ukraine itself runs through this movie in so many, many different ways. I think that's the reason why they've chosen to go down the route with setting the culmination, the end of the movie, with the final part of the First World War, leading to the signing of the armistice at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November. So without spoiling your own viewing of the film and giving too much away, that's kind of an overview of what the film is about. I mean, it is 2.5 hours and there's a lot in it, and you will get a lot, and there's a lot of very fine detail that I found watching it twice now that I missed the first time and saw in the second watching of it. There are some great little bits. There's a section where Kaczynski Kat is walking through a wood when they're behind the lines, and in the distance you can see, blink and you'll miss it, but you can see a dogfight going on between two aircraft, resulting in one of them being shot down. And I think detail like that is really good and really important because it kind of sets the story in a proper environment and a believable environment that it's not just a random forest somewhere in Germany or France, that this is set in a war with conflict going on all around them. So what did I think of the film? What did I think of this new version of All Quiet on the Western Front? It is an incredibly important and hugely impactful film about the First World War. There's no doubt about that. I've watched it twice now, and I know that I will watch it probably again and again, as I have done with the earlier versions. The history it sits in is good. This is a credible First World War film. There's no dramatic licenses really, except the final phase when the fictitious German attack goes in at the end of the war. But we have to remember that this is not a documentary. It's a film based on a work of fiction. So all of it's fiction. What it's trying to tell us is a wider story, and it does that superbly. It gives us that insight into the German side of the Great War. The film is in German throughout. The only other language that you hear is French when they're interacting with French civilians or when they're fighting French soldiers. There are subtitles, of course, but you don't, in the end, even really notice that it's in German. You see this, they're almost like universal soldiers, telling a universal story for all of those who fought and died and suffered and experienced and survived the trenches of the Great War. The film is very convincing on so many different levels in terms of how it depicts the Great War. The soldiers are very convincing. They look like soldiers. The uniforms that they are wearing, they have lived in. Very often with modern productions about any warfare, the soldiers look as if they've just put the uniform on, if it's come out of a cupboard or a storeroom and they've just slapped it on with a little bit of mud. These guys are filthy most of the time. You see them with bloodshot eyes from the concussion of explosions. You see them covered in their own blood and their comrades' blood. The uniforms are wet and sodden, and the men physically look and act like soldiers. And I think all of that is really important for a period drama to be convincing. Even if we know the story is pure fiction, to see them as real people, to understand them as real people, all of this is a part of it. The battle scenes throughout the film probably are what will draw many people into this. If you've seen some of the trailers, and I'll put some of those on the podcast website, the depiction of warfare in this film is excellent, if that's the right word. It's convincing. I'm going to use that word again. And again, I will say it is brutal. The battle scenes that we see when they attack trenches going across no man's land, men being cut down by machine gun fire, the randomness of death as shells or trench mortars land, all of that gives the film its credibility. And the big battle scene where the regiment goes over the top and captures a French position, then the French counter-attack, and they have the Saint-Chamond tanks that come in with the French assault waves. Now there is at least one surviving example of a Saint-Chamond in the Saumur Tank Museum in France, but it's not an operational vehicle. And what they've done for this film is make incredibly convincing mock-ups based on what look to be Russian BMP armoured personnel carriers. You notice the tracks as being part of a BMP. The rest of it is a really good depiction of what a Saint-Chamond tank was like, which was an assault gun basically inside an armoured box with a crew inside with machine guns, and it would go forward with assault waves, lay down assault artillery fire from its main gun and suppressive machine gun fire from its Hotchkiss machine guns that were on board the tank. Those tanks are then supported by French infantry, and also French infantry with flamethrowers, and then we see an even more brutal part of the film. But what we get from this is a good insight into what trench fighting between the French and the German armies were like in this period, this late period of the First World War. So they used the right weapons. We see Frenchmen with Hotchkiss machine guns, Germans with Maxim 08s. Didn't see any MGO 815s, the German light machine guns, in this, possibly because they're either not easily available or they're difficult to reproduce. The right infantry weapons, the French have Lebels, the Germans have the Gewehr 98s. So all of that is correct. The uniforms, the equipment, the tanks, the artillery, the battlefield depiction, the landscape. I mean, when I reviewed 1917, I spoke about the landscape of the Great War and the way that was depicted in that film. In All Quiet on the Western Front, we see a director who has obviously widely read about the Great War and transformed his vision of what he sees the Western Front to have been from the perspective of the 21st century into a credible and believable landscape that we know from the contemporary accounts. Is it right to call a war film beautifully shot? Because this certainly is, whether it's the opening and the closing sequences showing the German landscape, or whether it's that terrible, hellish, destructive, pulverised, shell-pocked landscape of the Western Front. It's filmed in a way which we can easily, if this was in a cinema, I think we would almost feel immersed in it, and I think you are definitely immersed in this story by the end of the film and the characters within it. And the characters, of course, are an essential part of the story. Without them being believable, we don't believe in the entire film. And what we see with this new version of All Quiet is largely unknown actors to us. Majority of them German, aside from Daniel Brühl, who plays Erzberger, pretty well-known German actor who's been in a lot of Hollywood movies, and some of the French actors in it who you might recognise from French TV series. This is not a cast full of famous faces. And again, I think that's probably important, a bit like it was important in 1917, that we're not focused on the actors, we're focused on the characters and the story that they have to tell. There's a part, for example, in the film where Kaczynski Katz is talking to Paul Baumer about how distant they are from the old world that they'd lived in, from the home front, from those left at home. He says that if we go back, we'll walk around like travellers in a landscape from the past. And I think phrases like that come from the discussions that you see in this film between the principal characters and how they react to the conditions of the war and living and fighting and dying in those trenches are all part of what we take away from this film. Is it a war film, or is it a film set in war? I think there's a big distinction there. Many will be asking, is it the Saving Private Ryan of the First World War? I would ask, do we need that? Is that essential? Does Saving Private Ryan give so much to what we know about Normandy and World War II that we need something similar for the Great War? Whether having watched it you decide or not, if that's the case, I think the biggest thing that we take away from this is that this film is a film that will come to a new generation, not just a new English-speaking generation, but a new European generation as well, particularly a new German generation. Knowledge and understanding, even awareness of the Great War is pretty limited in Germany. How will this affect a German audience when they see it? Will it make them pause and think and reflect on the Paul Baumers, the Albert Kropps, the Stanislas Kaczynskis in their own family trees? Will the more than 1.8 million dead that Germany lost in the Great War finally be remembered? One film can't possibly change all that, but it may lay the path to change. So those are my initial thoughts, without spoiling your own viewing of the film. Once it's out on general release, it comes to cinemas in the UK on the 14th of October, and then it's released on Netflix itself at the end of the month. And further down the line, we'll do a more in-depth look at the film and the different aspects of it once we've all had a chance to see it. But this is an excellent film. Go and see it. Watch it on your television. You won't forget this film in a hurry, nor its characters. And what I hope is this film will draw in a new audience to the story of the Great War and take them, too, down the pathways of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcore. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.